My name is Leonard Teel, and I'm a professor emeritus in communication at Georgia State University. I was a journalist for 20 years, ending up at the Atlanta Journal and Constitution. And I became professor of communication for the last 30 years and now retired. During the time I was a professor, I was asked to write a biography of Ralph McGill. My senior professor there had written a biography of Henry Grady, and he meant to do the biography of McGill, but he knew he didn't have time to do it. So he asked me to do it. So I wish I'd known McGill. I arrived at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution 6 months after he died in 1969. But 10 years after that, they had a celebratory commemoration of McGill on the 10th anniversary of his death. And I went to that, not knowing I was going to be writing the book later on. I went to that, and I drew from that two big things. Number one, that he was generally well-loved and much admired. 10 years later, people were still admiring him. Hadn't forgotten him like many journalists are forgotten. And the second thing was that almost all the people who spoke there or were in the audience had felt ennobled by him, by the fact of having known him, and ennobled their own careers and lives. I was very impressed with that. Once again, I didn't know I was going to be writing this biography. But when I started out in the mid-'80s working on the research, and it took me 14 years to write this book, research in Washington and everywhere you can think of, I just started by reading his books. And I started by writing articles for the American Journalism Historians Association, all of which were accepted for presentation at various conferences. So I built the book by sections. One of the first articles I wrote was about McGill's round-the-world trip in 1945 on behalf of freedom of expression. They were hoping that after World War II, they could establish freedom of expression in many, many countries around the world. And this was a project of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, on which McGill was the head of the Freedom of Information Committee. That was my first article about him and his very big interest in global affairs as well as local affairs. But his work in the civil rights movement was definitely the key to his whole life. And he, starting in 1949, when he'd been editor for about 17 years, he wrote his first piece on desegregation, but it was not for the Atlanta press. By then he had met people in Boston, Ted Weeks, editor of Atlantic Monthly, and felt that this was something, he and Weeks felt this was something that they could be published in Atlantic Monthly and may have some national impact, whereas it wouldn't be well received at the Atlanta Constitution because the focus was on separate but equal, the 1896 ruling Plessy versus Ferguson, which ruled that separate but equal was constitutional. But McGill, certainly not believing that, had examined the budgets of the state legislature of Georgia with respect to education, and discovered that, not unlikely discovery, that money going to the black schools for buildings and supplies and any number of things was so much less, was not equal, in other words. The schools were separate, but they weren't equal. The state was funding white schools far more, and with better buildings and better facilities and more advanced teachers and more teachers in general than black schools. So that was something he couldn't publish in the Atlanta Constitution because they weren't ready for that kind of thing. He published it in Atlantic Monthly. Of course, these things do get read nationally, and so he got some feedback on that, negative feedback. He was constantly receiving negative feedback in the terms of hate letters. Sometimes, as he pointed out, from people who didn't know how to spell. And he got phone calls as well, garbage on the lawn, over the years, and anything he wrote as far as civil rights was concerned before and after the Supreme Court Brown versus Board of Education case was law, usually was negative and attacking him personally. He would answer the phone at home and say, glad to hear from you. Okay, good, goodbye. And just wanted to protect his wife from this kind of abuse over the telephone, and cleaned up the garbage on the lawn and so forth. But it didn't stop him at all. And he was usually fighting this battle pretty much alone at the Atlanta Constitution until Gene Patterson joined him in the last decade of his life. He worked with Gene Patterson, and they were really great colleagues in fighting the civil rights movement in the pages of the Atlanta Constitution. The article he wrote on the bombing of the Jewish temple in Atlanta basically was a culmination of articles he'd written about bombings all over the South, in Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and he didn't get really a lot of attention from the national press or from anybody for those articles he wrote in condemning the hatred and the violence against blacks and against integration efforts after 1954. But he got a tremendous amount of attention and the Pulitzer Prize for writing the column he wrote about the bombing of the Jewish temple in Atlanta. The reason he felt was, while he had said all these things about places elsewhere, now he had the attention of his audience, and it was a resounding editorial. I really should read it to you because it's the one that won the Pulitzer Prize. I sometimes get emotional about this because I sense part of McGill is in me or something. So the following column was cited specifically by the Pulitzer Committee as an example of the editorial writing which won the Pulitzer Prize for Ralph McGill. It appeared originally on October 13, 1958, and was reprinted more than a decade later. Now, October 13 is the day after the bombing of the Jewish temple. So dynamite in great quantity ripped a beautiful temple of worship in Atlanta. It followed hard on the heels of a like destruction of a handsome high school at Clinton, Tennessee. The same rabid mad dog minds were, without question, behind both. They are also the source of previous bombings in Florida, Alabama, and South Carolina. The schoolhouse and the church were the targets of diseased, hate-filled minds. Let us face the facts. This is a harvest. It is the crop of things sown. It is the harvest of defiance of courts and the encouragement of citizens to defy law on the part of many Southern politicians. It will be the acme of irony, for example, if any one of 4 or 5 Southern governors deplores this bombing. It will be grimly humorous if certain attorneys general issue statements of regret. And it will be quite a job for some editors, columnists, and commentators who have been saying that our courts have no jurisdiction and that the people should refuse to accept their authority now to deplore. It is not possible to preach lawlessness and restrict it. To be sure, none said go bomb a Jewish temple or a school, but let it be understood that when leadership in high places in any degree fails to support constituted authority, it opens the gates to all those who wish to take the law into their hands. There will be, to be sure, the customary act of the careful drawing aside of skirts on the part of those in high places. How awful, they will exclaim. How terrible, something must be done. But the record stands. The extremists of the citizens' councils, the political leaders who in terms violent and inflammatory have repudiated their oaths and stood against due process of law, have helped unloose this flood of hate and bombing. This too is a harvest of those so-called Christian ministers who have chosen to preach hate instead of compassion. Let them now find pious words and raise their hands in deploring the bombing of a synagogue. You do not preach and encourage hatred for the Negro and hope to restrict it to that field. It is an old, old story. It is one repeated over and over again in history. When the wolves of hate are loosed on one people, then no one is safe. Hate and lawlessness by those who lead release the yellow rats and encourage the crazed and neurotic who print and distribute the hate pamphlets, who shrieked that Franklin Roosevelt was a Jew, who denounced the Supreme Court as being communist and controlled by Jewish influences. This series of bombings is the harvest, too, of something else. One of those connected with the bombing telephoned a news service early Sunday morning to say the job would be done. It was to be committed, he said, by the Confederate underground. The Confederacy and the men who led it are revered by millions. Its leaders returned to the Union and urged the future to be committed to building a stronger America. This was particularly true of General Robert E. Lee. Time after time, he urged his students at Washington University to forget the war between the states and to help build a greater and stronger Union. For too many years now, we have seen the Confederate flag and the emotions of that great war become the property of men not fit to tie the shoes of those who fought it. Some of these have been merely childish and immature. Others have perverted and commercialized the flag by making the stars and bars and the Confederacy itself a symbol of hate and bombings. For a long time now, it has been needful for all Americans to stand up and be counted on the side of law and the due process of law, even when to do so goes against personal beliefs and emotions. It is late, but there is yet time. So this is the column then that won him the Pulitzer Prize, and it's sort of like the epitome of all his thinking about the hate and the bitterness that was affecting the South at the time. I have really came to like Ralph McGill and identify with him in all this research. He has a number of columns that have nothing to do with civil rights, and that was one of his secrets. He would write maybe 5 or 6 columns a week, sometimes 7, and about 4 or 5 of them would be about something very simple in town, perhaps a fund drive at Georgia State, or something about the United Fund, or some people who are doing some good work in the community. And then he would throw in a civil rights column, which would catch people by surprise. They had 2 newspapers in the town at the time. The Atlanta Journal was the evening paper, and McGill wrote for the Constitution. And some people would read McGill in the morning, whether they liked him or not, just to see what they didn't like, or what they did like. Then there's the Atlanta Journal, which did not really approach civil rights at all. And I had the pleasure of interviewing the wife of Wright Bryan, the editor of the Atlanta Journal, and she said that Wright Bryan was told by the owner of the newspaper, who was Governor Cox of Ohio, not to discuss civil rights in his columns. They were verboten. He didn't want the newspaper to be accused of being run by a Yankee in Ohio and trying to impose Ohio views upon the Atlanta audience, whereas the Constitution was locally owned. So Wright Bryan was forbidden to do that, and Mrs. Bryan said, what McGill did, he just violated all the codes of mentioning civil rights and the Negro question. We called it the sitch, the situation, and he violated the sitch by talking about all this and calling attention to himself. She was most forthright and candid about that. So the Atlanta Journal went on, handcuffed basically from talking about these things, while McGill had full authority. Although at times even his friends at the newspaper and associate editor Jack Tarver told him to calm down a little bit, even when 1 column a week was too much for some of them. Tarver said that people read McGill, they either hated him or loved him. It either spoiled their breakfast or didn't, since it was a morning paper. So he was a controversial figure even at the newspaper. But he didn't let it stop him. He was single-minded and continued this on and on. As I mentioned earlier, this column was not one that he was totally new to the audience. It's just that here he put together everything for an audience that was really listening. He had a really good audience, and it was in Atlanta this time, not in Jacksonville, not in Alabama, not in Tennessee. It was in Atlanta, and it was the Temple. So it was a special situation, and he understood it right away. When he got back in town that day, he was told what had happened. He was in North Georgia, and he got back in town, he was told what happened, and he went straight to the newspaper. wrote this thing. His secretary, Grace Lundy, said he wrote it in 20 minutes. He was famous for really being able to write fast and write clearly. And it was like a draft. First draft, often people said his first drafts didn't need to be revised, unlike most people. He wrote very concisely and very fast. Two of his secrets along the way of his whole career, he wrote fast and wrote well. He'd been a sports writer in Tennessee for the first decade of his career. And when he came to Atlanta, it was as assistant sports editor in 1931. He was going to be the assistant sports editor, 1929, 1931. And he did sports for a while, but he really wanted to do something more serious. And in 1933, he saw a story out of Havana that was about the Cuban Revolution of 1933 against a hated dictator named Machado. And he begged off to go to Cuba to do a sports story on Cuban baseball, but that wasn't his intention. So he had to cloak what he was doing. They also didn't have much travel money. They were very parsimonious at the time. They had money for him to go to football events in other southern cities, but they didn't have money for travel to, say, Cuba to cover a revolution. So he had to cover that up a little bit and say he was going to cover Cuban baseball because there was some event going on down there. Well, anyway, what he did was he went in with the underground. He interviewed people in the underground. He interviewed the dictator. And this was all the thing about journalism. If you get a story, even though they didn't ask you to get it, if you get a story and they really like it, they'll publish it. So he knew that. So he didn't have to worry about whether they're going to publish it. And he got these wonderful interviews, and they published them. There's a whole series of stories in 1933 about the Cuban Revolution by Ralph McGill, reporter of the Atlanta Constitution. So that was his first break, and it showed that he didn't want to be a sports editor for the rest of his life. He loved international events. In 1937, he won a fellowship, and this was the end of his sports writing career. He won a fellowship to go to Europe. And Europe in 1937-38, when he was over there, was during the rise of Hitler. Hitler coming into Vienna, Hitler and the Czech nation in danger, was Hitler's rise to power during that time. And he was in Vienna when the Nazis had taken over, and when people were starting to say Sieg Heil in all the restaurants, he thought it was incredible. And he could see what was happening in Europe and wrote about it. So it also affected his view of civil rights as well. He saw civil rights immediately taken away by the Nazis. And the freedom-loving Austrians were suddenly subjugated to a regimen of Heil Hitlers and losing their freedoms almost overnight by the takeover. So McGill wrote about that. He came back, and coming back, the death of the associate editor of the Constitution, who wrote editorials, opened up a position for him. He probably might have become an associate editor anyway, but this made it much easier. So he was appointed associate editor in 1938, and then by 1942 he'd become editor. So from 1942 until the 60s, when he also became publisher, he wrote these columns. So there are hundreds and hundreds of Ralph McGill columns, because even when he went on vacation, he wrote 6 or 7, 8 columns in advance so he wouldn't be missed. He had this feeling that people needed to see him every day. And so his columns were always coming out. A couple of times when he was on vacation, he would beg to go away and write a column or dictate one straight from where he was. Something had occurred to him, or there was something occurring in that place, and he just needed to get another column in. So he was fast, and he was thorough, and he just wrote so many columns that you can track his entire life through these columns. They're like a diary in a sense, but much more profound entries than a diary. Well, when he became an associate editor and editor, we're talking about the Eugene Talmadge period of the late 30s. The state was thoroughly segregated, and the governor pried into everything, including the university. Had the University of Georgia disaccredited for a short period of time because of the governor's intervention with the Board of Trustees. And so there was a break, though, in the early 40s when a liberal governor, Ellis Arnold, was elected. And this was wonderful for McGill because he and Arnold could lunch at the Capitol on tuna fish sandwiches and talk government. And he was the liberal light for about 5 years. He was never reelected. It was during that period McGill was able to establish himself as the editor and turn the newspaper toward more enlightened discussion of issues, albeit very carefully, not advocating desegregation or anything like, or integration, a worse word, integration, but cautiously easing the people into thinking about economic issues that were important, such as freight rates. The South had been distinguished and discriminated against in freight rates. They were higher than in the North, and Ellis Arnold managed to, with McGill's help and campaigning on this, managed to get freight rates more comparable to what the rest of the nation had for. So these are economic issues that McGill worked with. So he expanded the range of editorial comment from the time he became an associate editor very shortly. And then, of course, after he became editor in 42, he greatly expanded the range of editorials. Always keeping in mind that people like to read about themselves. And so his columns about local people were common. And he liked local people. He liked to tell stories, and local people had plenty of stories. And then he also brought up stories from the Old South, too, like the man who claimed that he was the only person in the world who had taken apart a biscuit and been able to put it back together again exactly the way it had been. And he used that as a story saying that Southern governors have not been able to do that. They've been inviting all this industry and business in, and the biscuit has come apart, but they can't put it back together again because the South is changing. It can't be the same old biscuit. So he could use Southern lore like that to get people's attention. It's a Southernism, but he used it in a modern way to show what was going on. And he could see the New South developing. But he was way ahead of everybody in the sense that he could see it beyond what they could see. But he couldn't write about that yet because it was too far in the future. He took people along step by step. He felt like gradualism was the key to persuasiveness as far as the South was concerned. Until the South became crazy in the 50s and started bombing, people started bombing, and then he had to be more heavy-handed. And that's when he took all the politicians to task for advocating disobedience to the Supreme Court, advocating against the law of the land, and took them to task as being basically fomenting violence and disrespect across the country, across the state and the region. So that's the culture he came into, and that's how he sort of reshaped the culture of the newspaper, edging it forward, not dramatically at one time, but step by step. Well, the challenges after McGill's period have not been as serious as what McGill faced. Because with McGill, you're talking about writing against the current of history that had been legalized in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson. Separate but equal had been legalized. And people had gotten into that, and it was the legal way of doing things. So you had to change the entire law. So when in 1954 it actually was changed, people weren't accepting. And it was like turning a train around. McGill had seen it coming. He wrote a column once, Come One Monday, because he saw that there were cases, at least 3 cases, challenging Plessy versus Ferguson that were coming before the Supreme Court. So he knew that some Monday, when the Supreme Court was in the practice of handing down decisions, come one Monday there would be some decision that might change things around. So he was trying to prepare people for this, although there's very little you could do to prepare people for the reality. But he tried by indicating that the way of life was going to change, and it was going to change through the Supreme Court. And when it did change through the Supreme Court, then you had a revolt against the Supreme Court. You know, impeach Earl Warren, bumper stickers everywhere. And that was a different fight then, to uphold the law of the land. And that's what he was talking about with Southern segregationist editors, who actually urged people to believe that they could defy the Supreme Court. And then he blamed them, Southern demagogues, for encouraging the racist attacks, the bombings, killings, and so forth. So it was a sequence. There was a sequence of events there between his preparing people for something, and then his telling people that they needed to obey the supreme law of the land, and condemning the people who were stirring up the opponents to this, all the way to the governor's mansions. So it was a time that was a very challenging period, and he was up to the challenge. He was an amazing man for his time. I don't think we've had any such challenge since then, where the whole nation has to change its course so dramatically because the court had altered a basic way of life. So I think the Atlanta Constitution was where he was able to steer people, right-minded people, in the right direction, and condemn those who were wrong-minded, in his opinion. Well, until Gene Patterson came aboard, McGill really didn't have a sidekick, somebody who could bounce ideas against. Jack Tarver, who was his dear friend and supporter, basically only urged him to write fewer such columns. That was his advice. It seemed like you were getting too many of those columns, he would say, too frequent. So that's not the kind of advice McGill really needed. Tarver was against shaking the ship. But Gene Patterson and McGill saw things in the similar light, and they could work together. Gene Patterson eventually left in 1968 before McGill died for a job at the Washington Post, and McGill really hated to see him go, but it was a great opportunity. And then later he went to the St. Pete Times. But anyway, that was a period of time that McGill was very happy in the mid-60s with working with Gene Patterson, and he finally had a buddy. McGill died in '69. In one of his last talks to a high school group in the black section of town, this is 5 years after, this is in '69, that's 5 years after the Supreme Court ruling, 15 years after the Supreme Court ruling, he told them he just sensed that he wasn't going to live too long because he'd had a heart condition and he was maintaining. He says he wishes he were alive to see what was going to happen in the future. He really would like to trade places with them and live to see what was going to happen in the future. He was very confident about the future. He really was hoping for it, and sorry that he wasn't going to be there to share it. Well, the Atlanta Constitution supported Mayor Ivan Allen and the other city fathers, and in the work of desegregation. The city fathers early on figured out that if they had to desegregate from 1954 onward now, if they had to desegregate, they better do it sooner than the other cities in the South. If it was the law of the land as was decreed in '54, then after '54 they needed to come to some kind of idea about how Atlanta could do it peacefully and first in order to maintain a leadership role in the South. Leadership in business was a big factor, to be the business capital of the Southeast. And they were competing against Birmingham and and Charlotte, North Carolina, and a few other cities, but those were the main ones. And McGill was totally in line with that. They worked together on this. And Mayor Ivan B. Allen was very progressive, and they managed to desegregate swimming pools ahead of the rest of the South. They didn't desegregate schools right away, but swimming pools and public facilities, they could do that in the city of Atlanta. And so that was one of the things where the newspaper actually worked in tandem with the Chamber of Commerce and the mayor and the president of Coca-Cola, Robert Woodruff, who was a major factor. In 1965, when Martin Luther King Jr. won the Nobel Peace Prize and was coming home, they started to prepare a big celebration for him. And this is an interesting fact that the FBI director, Edgar Hoover, was very upset with McGill and Patterson for doing this. He said, "Why are you doing this? You're trying to make this man look honorable, and he's not an honorable man." And they tried to get McGill to join against the celebration, and one of the things McGill was doing was actually arranging a celebratory dinner for Martin Luther King, and they weren't having many people buying tickets for this at the Dinkler Plaza Hotel. So it was not going very well. But McGill was still determined to go forward with it, even though J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI was opposed to it. So they were putting pressure on McGill and Patterson and others to ditch Martin Luther King. Don't call any special attention to him. Anyway, since the dinner wasn't going well, there was a problem. And the story that Gene Patterson tells is that the president of Coca-Cola went over to the Piedmont Driving Club one day, and when everybody was gathered, all the important people in town, just in the evening or whatever, and said, "Boys, the boss wants us to go." Still gets to me. "Boys, the boss wants us to go to the dinner." And they all signed up. They sold out the dinner to honor Martin Luther King because the boss, Robert Woodruff, wanted them to go to the dinner. So that's a kind of personal diplomacy that was being conducted among a few people in Atlanta. President of Coca-Cola, McGill, Mayor Ivan Allen, and the Rabbi Rothschild at the temple. These people were working together. It's one of the reasons, I guess, why the temple was targeted for bombing in 1958. So it was an amazing coalition of people who saw that civil rights were here to stay after the Civil Rights Act of '64, Supreme Court ruling of '54, and we better get on the boat, on the bandwagon or whatever, and lead the South instead of following behind. And be exemplary. And it was also deemed to be good for business.